Thanks so much for the introduction, Professor Auerbach, and thanks also to the Lieberthal-Rogel Center for Chinese Studies for the kind invitation for me to come. Can you hear me okay in the back? Yeah? Okay, good. So today what I want to do is I want to talk about Śākyamuni, the historical Buddha at Dunhuang. And in general, the situation is that people tend to think that Śākyamuni wasn't so important at Dunhuang, but in fact, I think it's just the opposite. And it's how you look at the material evidence, that really highlights the role of Śākyamuni and as a sort of cult of Śākyamuni at Dunhuang, and I think in medieval China in general. So discussions of religious life in Tang and Song period China generally stress the demise of Śākyamuni's role in cultic worship. Research in Buddhist ritual, text, doctrine, and visual culture during the medieval era maintained the worship of Śākyamuni peaked during the Northern Way and declined in favor of Amitabha, Maitreya, and other lesser cosmic Buddhas. Numerous studies on the so-called cult of Maitreya, right, Mila Xinyang or Miroku Shinko, cult of Manjushri, right, cult of Amitabha, cult of Avalokiteshvara, exist, but little or nothing exists on an equivalent cult of Śākyamuni. These foci for cultic worship form a major scholastic categorization for medieval practice. The other organizational principle for medieval Buddhism, now increasingly problematized, has been schools or sects, right? The usual list being Chan, Tiantai, Huayan, Pure Land, etc. Researchers focus on doctrine and associated practices of these schools or sects, typically exclude popular Buddhism and its practices inclusive of the population's interaction with Śākyamuni, right? So these, between, as I say, the warp in the devotional cults and the weft of sectarian divisions, little room seems to be left for the founder of the religion as a cultic and devotional figure. And it's only recently that scholars have begun to pay attention to Śākyamuni. In Japan, we have a recent study done by Professor Auerbach, but in China, still there's no major monograph certainly, and there's no major investigative studies of a sort of the cultic role of Śākyamuni in medieval China. And I think it's just, in fact, the opposite. My research has led me to the conclusion that despite his ontological absence, right, of course, after parinirvana, Śākyamuni figured so large in medieval religious life that scholarship has overlooked his presence. And so in this talk, what I'd like to do is examine a range of material from Dunhuang, Mogao, and examine exactly how canonical text, liturgical texts, various illustrative versions of Śākyamuni's life, but also ancillary texts point to the very, very important role of Śākyamuni especially during the late Tang, Five Dynasties, and early Song period. So we're talking from the 8th to 10th, 11th centuries. What's interesting and I think above all is what we have a very, very vernacular portrayal of Śākyamuni. So the historical Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama Buddha, becomes somebody who in some ways is very approachable and not a cosmic Buddha, not a figure who is distant and awe-inspiring, but someone who in some ways is very, very human and is very much a teacher and a spiritual guide. And finally, I want to close with how the stylistics and the aesthetics of Dunhuang caves themselves reinforce and highlight this centrality of Śākyamuni in cultic life at Dunhuang. So let me begin with Dunhuang itself, and maybe some of you don't have any acquaintance with Dunhuang, but it's located, I promise no LASIK surgery. It's located here in this, along the Silk Road in the so-called Hashi corridor. There it is located along the Silk Road for a larger picture. And the oasis itself, right, so what we're looking at is a collection of caves, over 700 caves at one particular site, Mogao, Mogao Cave, which is located in a ravine 25 kilometers. This is the central oasis of Dunhuang, here and here. The central, so an even smaller oasis that's located 25 kilometers away from the large oasis of Dunhuang. And these caves were the apocryphal, maybe not apocryphal, the story of their construction begins in 366 with a monk who was inspired to dig a cave in a cliff face, which I'll show you in a moment. The caves continued to be built and became a major pilgrimage site until the 14th century. So here is the cliff face, and as you can see, this is taken, we're looking west, and, we're looking west, and here, this is north, this direction, south, this direction. Behind these are actually sand dunes, which are quite impressive for their sheer size and the fact that they haven't completely overwhelmed the caves, although this is one reason why these caves have been preserved in part because of their isolation. In front of this, this cliff face is a very, very small oasis of a few hundred yards across. And here's a plan, if you will, of the caves. Again, over 700, 492 of them have been numbered, and these have been chosen in part because they're caves, as I'll show you in a second, that are completely painted on the inside. So they're, and they contain, the site itself is fantastic because of the wealth of materials that it contains. A variety of artistic, iconographical, religiously inspired art, in addition to a collection of manuscripts and paintings on silk, paintings on paper, and votive objects and ritual paraphernalia found in a cave. So over 50,000 manuscripts were discovered in a cave around the year 1900. And these manuscripts and additional materials have been dispersed throughout the world in the British Museum, British Library, the National Library of France, St. Petersburg, also in Japan. So there's a wealth of material, and all these materials together, right? And these manuscripts include everything from economic records of monasteries. The vast majority are Buddhist scriptures, but also texts in Hebrew, right? Texts in Tibetan, texts in various Central Asian languages. It's quite a range of material, and these materials reflect the role of this site as a pilgrimage center along the Silk Road, which in many ways was funded both by trade and the elite families in the area that controlled the trade, or who controlled the trade. So it's a fantastic find, and I think above all it represents a type of ethnographic collection, right? These materials were sealed up in a cave around the year 1000. They're discovered around the year 1900, and they represent a slice of life, many slices of life, of materials that otherwise would have been thrown away. So they're unvetted in some ways, and this is what makes them so fascinating, that nobody went and did a triage in the year 1000 as they put them into the cave. There's materials that include things like people practicing their Chinese characters. For those of us who know who studied Chinese or Japanese, we know how unattractive they can look, all right? And these are very much what some of these manuscripts have. They were reused again and again and again due to the dearth and scarcity of paper. So there are all sorts of very fascinating, very immediate materials. So in this sense, it is very much a ethnographic collection. So this is the site. We're going to look at a number of caves, and then within those caves, I want to concentrate, focus on screens, these painted screens and depictions of Śākyamuni's life. And what are these screens doing? What are these illustrations of Śākyamuni's life as depicted? So, and what we'll do is we'll start with family caves. And family caves are essentially caves that were created by elite families who gathered together and pooled their funds and created caves as, in effect, family shrines. So they're shrines for worship. They function in a very particular way, which I'll explain. And the first family cave is cave 220. Which was constructed in 642, the Jai family cave. And how these caves work, I'm throwing out my paper, essentially. How these caves work is that they were carved out of a cliff face. It would the construction of the cave itself could take a year, 2 years maximum, depending on the size of the caves. They're carved out. The soil is perfect for this, right? It's not hard rock. It's a kind of very tightly compacted loess soil. So these caves were carved top down. They start at the top, and then they carve the caves out, then plaster the walls with this sort of mud and wattle. Then on top of that, create mural paintings. By the time they started in 366. Our earliest caves are from the 5th century. But here, they began, the reason why I want to look at family caves is because they began to take on a very particular style and format. And that style has to do with a Western niche, right? Remember, they all face the West, and the West is very important in Buddhism because the West is, of course, where Amitabha's Pure Land is. So facing West has soteriological significance. And here, what we get with these family caves is the first depiction of large Sutra tableaus, right? So here you can see on this area here, that we have Western paradise, and I'll show you in a second. This is the niche that we see here. The healing ritual, this is the scripture or sutra of Bahasha Guru, right? And then Manjushri and Vimalakirti and the Vimalakirti Sutra. So here we have 3. But what's really fascinating about these family caves is that we have a shift. Before this, we have images of Buddha's preaching. But now we have images of what was preached, right? So it's a very, very, very important shift. And as I argue, it's because I believe that there's a shift towards a vernacular approach because it's the elite families who are funding these caves and essentially calling the shots in what they want depicted. And I'll explain more in detail why that's the case. So, and this is a picture of the Bahasha Guru, the Sutra of the Medicine King. It's not a very clear image, and I apologize for that, but it starts the standard format where we have a central icon and then a sort of paradise setting, and it'll be clear in the pictures to follow that there's a temple setting in the background. And so what we have is we have a representation of a deity, of a Buddha, preaching the sutra that's being depicted. So it's very interesting. Not only do we have an icon of the Buddha himself, but we have a depiction of the text itself. So this is important because when people are essentially creating these as gifts to the Buddha, right, creating these images in these caves as gifts to the Buddha, in honor of deceased family members, in honor of living members and associates, not only are they creating a sacred space, but they're also gifting, if you will, a text. But that text is also its image, right? So they're gifting image, text, and icon. So these sutra tableaux are very fascinating because they collapse a number of features that we have separated otherwise into a single image. I'm sorry, Amitabha Sutra, I'm sorry. Yeah. So, and here, stepping back a little further into the entranceway, you can see, this is perhaps clear, you can see the back niche. This is the Amitabha Sutra here, this is the Bahasha Guru Sutra here. Sorry for that confusion. And what's important to note here is that the niche is not that distinguished from the surrounding wall. And that point is important, and I'll come back to that in a moment. So this is the first family cave, and again, what it does is it sets up a precedent which is followed for the rest of the period of extensive construction of caves up until the Song period. And that has to do with these sutra tableaux, these jingbian or benxing, which are depicted. as we move forward in time, what happens during the so-called return to righteousness army period, this is after the Tibetans take over this area, the Han, who have been in control since the Nanbei Chao, the northern southern period, again regain control over Dunhuang. It becomes isolated as the Tang breaks down, and you can see this enclave here. But we have a series of elite families, the Zhang family, right, the Suo, the Cao family, who then go on to create these caves. And they create very, very large, extensive caves. And we're going to look at one of those caves in particular. And in spite of the fact, but it's important to understand that in spite of the fact of the seeming isolation of Dunhuang, the elites were very, very interested in modeling themselves on the elites of central China, the Chinese plain. And so everything from textual fashions to fashions, to the aesthetics of the cave, to rituals, they're very, very much in touch because it was that identity played itself as a bulwark against what might be seen as barbarians around the periphery of Dunhuang. So it was very important to assume a Chineseness, and we'll see this in the caves as they develop, an aesthetic that comes to dominate, and overall the caves move from a Central Asian aesthetic to an increasingly Sinocentric or Chinese aesthetic. So these are the types, so these are the large caves. So we're going to look at cave 61, but this is the large cave format that begins to become dominant during this period. And you can see similarities here, but basically it's a square, a large square, with a trapezoidal ceiling, the apex of which is a sort of heavenly well, what's called a heavenly well, and then a central platform with a screen backing. Now the main deities that would sit on that platform were either Maitreya or Śākyamuni, but in the case of cave 61, it's very interesting, it would be Manjushri, the bodhisattva of wisdom. Oops. And just to look at the program on the wall, what we have a sort of bifurcated set here of registers. So down here, these are the donor images and certain sutras, in this case, the Sutra of the Wise and the Foolish. And then above it are those large tableaux, which we saw in Cave 220, these jingbian or benxing, these large sutra tableaux. And here we can see the sutras themselves listed, Lankavatra, Maitreya, Amitabha, Lotus. And then this is Cave 61 here, with its pictorial program. And this is where we find the Buddha's life story. And so this format is very standard. This format is very standard among these large family caves that were created during the late Tang, Five Dynasties, and early Song period. But what it does is it sets up a dichotomy, right? So on the lower register, and we'll look at those in detail, these are these screens. So pingfeng, right? These what would be seen as folding screens, but in fact they're painted, right? They're painted. They're mural paintings, and then along the top register, these are major sutras, and as I'll describe in a second, these are this bifurcation between narrative and sutra is fundamental, and in some ways you can read it as a sort of path goal, right? So these karmic narratives that we see at the bottom tell stories of karma and rebirth, so-called Avadana stories, sometimes Jataka, but mostly Avadana stories. And then in many ways, what you have above are the goals, right? Because these large tableaux represent Pure Land settings, right? So wherever you have a Buddha in his, because it's always a he, his purest form, that is a Pure Land, right? Because you get the purest Dharma, right? The Dharma hasn't begun to degenerate yet. It's true Dharma. So this is what these Pure Land settings of a Buddha preaching that particular sutra, for example, the Lotus Sutra or Amitabha Sutra, represent. And in fact, that's where you want to be reborn, right? In popular Buddhism at Dunhuang, this is the goal, right? People, this is a popular Buddhism. It's not so interested in meditation. It's very interested in finding soteriological strategies and means to give you a better rebirth into preferably one of these Pure Lands. This ideas about nirvana, cessation of being, these really don't enter into the picture. It's a very hands-on, very basic kind of Buddhism. I should also note that it's non-sectarian, right? So we don't have any one group, for example, Tiantai or Pure Land or Chan Zen, none of these groups dominate the majority of manuscripts that were used in popular liturgies and practices here. And as you can see here, with this range of sutras depicted, it's not centered on one particular group or sect. It's all of them. So it's sort of hedging all bets in being inclusive. And of course, this is a very Chinese and practical way to deal with the unknown and strategies for soteriology. So on to cave 161. So here's the main chamber, and I was very, let's see if I can, okay. So this one cave actually has been digitized, and so it is possible to, and I was afraid to show this because I was afraid it wouldn't work, but this is cave 61, and this has been digitized relatively well by the Dunhuang Research Academy. So you can look at it carefully. My frustration is that it doesn't quite have the detail I need for a full analysis of the screens, which I want to show you. But how the cave is set up is, let's see this way. So here, if we turn, this is the entrance facing east. And this has been repainted in the Yuan dynasty. So normally this would have had the donors entering, the major donors, the Cao family, entering the cave in homage to the main icon. What's really interesting is that then the other donors depicted here are facing not the icon, but they're facing the entrance of the elite family, right? So there's something very humanistic about that. And it's a bit unusual. We get this, there's a kind of hubris that goes along with these elite families as they construct these very large caves. Donor figures used to be quite small. They get larger and larger. In fact, if I can stop this, they would have stood maybe, yay big where the cursor is for the main donors. So it's quite interesting. So these are the screens that we're interested here. You can see the large tableau. In the back of this is a picture, a map, in fact, of Wutai Mountain, Wutai Shan. And then here, this feature here is actually the tail of a lion on which Manjushri would sit. And the reason why Manjushri is pictured here is, the ideological reason is because a number of the Cao family had married families from nearby Wutai Shan. So there were very interesting political connections there. This cave is built in homage to them. And if I can just stop it. I don't know why it keeps moving. Built in homage to them. And so, as long as it doesn't spin so fast, it gets sick. Right, so there are very, very political motives. The people, the donors who are there are ranked very specifically. They have cartouches with their names, whether they're living or deceased. And so it's quite a big production. And if you if you played your cards right, maybe you would be included, right, into one of these Cao family caves. So enough of this. But yes, I say Yi Dunhuang is the site. It's a fascinating site. They haven't reproduced all the caves by any means, but they're starting. And it gives, the other alternative site to look at a lot of these caves is Art Store, the Database art Store. And there the quality is a little bit better. And of course, we have many, many publications as well. But back to the narrative. So yes, so back to the screens. So, okay. So this is the main chamber, and so what's interesting about this is that originally, we know from archaeological research that there was an exterior chamber. And this is very, very common in a sense. And this exterior chamber here has since disappeared. So originally there were multiple chambers. Now this is important because for the longest time people said, oh, in Dunhuang caves, they told stories, they did picture storytelling and held rituals, and people meditated. It's likely that this is not the case, right? It's likely this is not the case for a number of reasons. One, the evidence doesn't demonstrate it, right? The caves, the main chambers themselves, are so far set back from the cliff face via the antechamber and the tunnel that it was very, very difficult to get light in these caves. So what this means is if you were to hold rituals on a regular basis, you would need torches, right? And these torches would leave soot. And these caves are just too pristine. There's simply not that evidence, right? Certainly rituals were held, consecration rituals. We know that, for example, the king of Khotan, who was related by marriage to the Cao family, came and visited. These sorts of dignitaries would come and visit. But nobody was hanging out in these caves doing rituals on a regular basis. Also, remember, these are private family shrines, right? So in some ways, you don't want the hoi polloi coming in, desecrating your very expensive sacred spaces. So think of, maybe an analogy would be to think of sacred chapels in cathedrals, these side chapels that typically have gates and are used only for very, very special occasions, otherwise remain off limits, but there for you to see and for you to envy. And so certainly these caves were similar in that sense. So again, here we see this is the entrance, this is the eastern wall with the donors depicted. There's the donors in detail in all their finery, females. And again, we would have cartouches with their names here. The south wall. And this is where the stories about Śākyamuni begin, right? So we have the donors, and then we have these screens, which also, and these pingfeng, these folding screens. And the narrative then continues, as you can see in the drawing here. The narrative continues there around the back wall with the map of Wu Taishan above it. And again, remember the top register tends to represent a destination, a goal, a soteriological goal. So what this is doing is it's equating Wu Taishan with Pure Lands, right, which is very, very important. And again, the register below is the path, right? So these are the karmic paths taken to get to a salvational place of some kind. And again, then around the north wall, it continues, and you can see the large tableau and the screens below. Now, these little black boxes are cartouches, and so you can, and I'll show one in detail in a second. These are cartouches, but you can see also in the large Sutra tableau that there are also cartouches, which indicates that people weren't always too clear about the contents and needed to have those indicated to them. The other way to distinguish these large Sutra tableaus is by the sheer schematics of them. So, for example, this is the Avatam Sutta, as we say here, right? This is the medicine Buddha here. What happens is there becomes a stylized format that even simply stepping back, you'd be able to recognize the sutra itself in question. Maybe not the detailed scenes, but at least the sutra you would be able to recognize. Oops, okay. So now if we begin to look at the screens themselves, what we're interested in, right? So we have these screens, a biography of the Buddha. Why are these screens talking about the biography of Buddha? What's the significance? And how is the Buddha depicted within that biography? Well, it's fascinating because we actually have a scripture, a manuscript that contains some of the material from the screens themselves, right? So this was basically a series of notes on what to write in the cartouches. And here it's from the Buddha, the previous deeds of the Buddha, this collection, this very famous sutra, which becomes the the centerpiece, if you will, for the depiction of Buddha during this period. So let me return to this. So the Sutra of the collection of the authentic deeds of the Buddha. These are very interesting. They're actually numbered. We have the numbered list. And then each ending by the word chu, right? Place, here, as you can see here. So this is a place where such and such happened, right? So these are the cartouches placed on the screens. Now, what the relationship is to perform narrative, that's a good question. That's a very, very interesting question that needs research. But so what I'm interested in is all these materials that begin to come together across images, texts, and rituals that indicate how important Śākyamuni is. So there are 33 of these screens. And what they do is they break down in the following way, right? So they talk about the previous life of the Buddha and the prediction from Dipamkara that he would become Buddha, right? This is Sumedha. Also, then, who is the Buddha? Lineage, right? Then the conception and birth of Siddhartha from Maya out of her side. And then, excuse me, his princely life, 4 encounters, enlightenment, teaching career, and then nirvana. Now, what's really fascinating is that the bulk of these stories talk about his princely life, right? They don't talk about his preaching career. And typically in scriptures on Śākyamuni's life, his teaching career is really not discussed at all. It's all about him becoming the Buddha, right? So his previous life, his birth, his education, and then the conversion, right? The exit from the palace, and then the austerities that he practiced for 6 years, and Mara, the defeat of evil, right? During his enlightenment. But the teaching career, right? So this is where the bulk of the scriptures, right? The sutras that we have, these are the words of the Buddha, right? Buddha Vachana. In fact, they're never really discussed, and there are probably reasons for this. One, that it avoids the messy complications of which sutras are really the best sutras, or which sutras are sort of non-sectarian. The Chinese were confronted by this major problem as Buddhism came into China from India. It brought wave after wave of scripture. Now, which were the true scriptures, right? Which were the best scriptures? What were the most efficient scriptures for salvation, right? For spiritual practice. This was an ongoing problem that the Chinese deal with. The stories of historical Buddha's life, Śākyamuni's life, just ignore it, right? So that's a sort of convenient way not to deal with it. On the other hand, the story of Śākyamuni is very interesting because as it concentrates on his educational career, it focuses in many ways on central concerns to Chinese, which is education, right, and proper upbringing. And you can see the bulk of these narratives are concerned with that. Very, very different. If you took the sutra from which this came, that's not an equivalence, right? So what we have is represented visually is a very particular focus. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at one screen in particular, which is panel 24, right here in the corner. And it's the item here. Now, I should point out that, again, these are mock folding screens, right? And you can see what they actually do is they actually have this sort of trompe-l'oeil feature. These are hinges, right? So what they've done, and I'll come back to this point in a second, what they've done is they've replicated in great detail, right? There could be a variety of styles, but what they've done is replicated in great deal an item that people would be familiar with in their daily lives, folding screens, right? So this is the Siddhartha's 4 encounters. And I apologize for the quality. It's not as clear, but it may become clear as we move forward, right? So here we have the prince exiting the gate. Here, unfortunately, you can't see it, but as he goes out, a servant is there to clean the way, because, of course, his father is concerned about what he'll see. So he wants a pristine and Potemkin light, which, of course, fails. and he sees an old person, right? The old person is here depicted really. The second, right? So these are the orders of the cartouche as indicated by the text. He sees a sick person, right? And here the sick person is depicted. So the prince sends a messenger telling the king he desires to exit the west gate. Here he's exiting the west gate there. And then finally, he exits the north gate and sees the renunciant. The renunciant here is in surprisingly monastic robes. So, and then finally, his father strengthens the imperial guards around the palace to prevent the prince from leaving. And we can look at this a little bit more detail. Here's the guards being posted out. Here you can see bring out the troops, more troops on the roofs here. This is Śākyamuni here. What his father says, turn up the music, more dancing, more women, right, and keep them distracted. So here you can see women dancing, they're playing flutes here. But it's interesting that half these are the four encounters, and yet half of it is devoted to the father who's concerned and anxious about his son, right? So it's very, very human concerns. It's almost not so much about Śākyamuni, right? Of course it is. But here we have the focus on the human aspect, right? The anxiety that a father has for his losing his son, essentially. And there are many, many features of these narratives. I don't have time to go into them all at all. Wow, okay. But there are many, many features. For example, the drama of Yashodhara, his Śākyamuni's wife, comes up, right? She becomes a major figure in these narratives. And now, narratives about Śākyamuni are not consistent. There are a variety of tales. But in the Chinese tellings, Yashodhara, his wife, has a difficult time, right? So there's a version where she remains pregnant for 6 years. Tell me that's not a problem. She remains pregnant for 6 years as he goes off and does his ascetic practices, right? Another version, she leaves and she says, "Oh, I'm going to go meet, my husband in the mountains." And she goes to the mountains. He says, "Oh, it's great to see you. Let me make you into a man," right? So she becomes a man, right? There's another story where she is accused of adultery by Śākyamuni's father because Śākyamuni points his whip at her before he leaves. And there's no physical contact, points his whip and says, "You're now pregnant." She becomes pregnant. Her father-in-law doesn't believe her and has her put on trial. Right, so these are all very, very interesting dramatic developments that you don't find in canonical texts, but clearly reflect concerns of women, concerns of husband and wife relationships, father-daughter, father-in-law daughter relationships, these sorts of things. Very, very humanizing aspects. So, okay, let me just skip very quickly. And so what we have, in addition to these images, we have a large, large set of textual materials. So we have song cycles, we have eulogies, we have liturgical texts, these narratives, even a theatrical piece, right? So we have the earliest theater script, right, is from Dunhuang. And this text here, and there's an edited version for you to see the parts that were actually sung and spoken. Right, so there was a dance, there were dance troupes. It was a masked performance. Now, all these texts, and with these texts above also, these liturgical texts, what this points to is that we have a set of texts that were used in liturgies. And these liturgies are very much like Western or Catholic or Christian masses in some ways, where you'd have an explanation or explication of texts, but also stories. So if you know in terms of medieval Christianity, exempla, right? So these narrative stories depicting moral practices. Well, that's what we get at Dunhuang. So we have a wide range of textual materials, some of which are listed here, these narratives, that talk about not only Śākyamuni's life, but also as I'll go down further. Also stories about his contemporaries. Now, what's really fascinating, this is what's so interesting, is that these narratives are very, very clearly circumscribed in terms of content, right? So, and what we have is we have these same narratives painted on the screen. So these would be stories from the scripture of the wise and the foolish, the Xian Yu Jing. They would be stories that would only have to do with characters during Śākyamuni's life. So my point, and I'll try to make it fast because we don't have much time, is that what we have are these large-scale popular, so-called popular lectures, Sūjiang, right? These popular lectures, these liturgical performances, where we'd have an explanation of a scripture and also narrative entertainment, right? And what we get in the Dunhuang caves, we get a replication of this very, very same format, right? So the artistic program, what it does is, in effect, it's replicating the liturgical format of these Sūjiang. These are similar in Japan to koshiki in many, many ways, a very similar format. Where you have in koshiki, just like in Sūjiang, you have both narrative, you have storytelling, and you also have the explanation of sutras. So what we get is we have these large tableaux with the scriptures, and then these narrative panels below of karma and rebirth. These are, in effect, materials that we have outside the caves. So this, for example, is a painting on silk of Śākyamuni. And we know that these were hung in ritual circumstances during these popular lectures, right? And these were large-scale events that sometimes would have thousands of people, but they were done for the creation of merit. But they're also very social occasions where you show your status and also network with political alliances. These large tableaux, right? These are these large Sutra tableaux with the screens below. Here we have one in detail, right? The Amitabha Sutra. Well, the fact is we also have these painted on silk in the same style. So my point, right? My point is that all these materials came together in these caves, because what in effect people were doing is they were recreating these liturgical spaces outside the caves, but they're doing them in painting on walls within a conserved setting, because this way they could be preserved forever, right? So what they're in effect doing is they're creating karmic bonds with the Buddha. They're doing it in ways that have been set up, right? Because these images of Buddhist narratives are specifically based on Śākyamuni's life, right? They're not based on Amitabha or Avalokiteshvara, Guanyin. They're very, very circumscribed, also not only in contents, but in genre markers. And so what people are doing, also these niches, right, which I talked about, these niches replicate a teaching platform that also would have been used in these popular lectures. So what these elite families are doing is they're creating a site in perpetuity for the donors to be there forever in the presence of the Buddha who is lecturing, right? Forever in the presence of the Dharma. Because of course the converse of this is the degeneration of the Dharma, right? As time goes on, the Dharma disappears and disintegrates and eventually will disappear completely. One way you prevent this is through creating sites that are unchanging, which may seem very un-Buddhist in some ways. Finally, if I could just make one more point, the realism of these Dunhuang caves, the realism of these elite family caves is something very particular that we have. And let me just read something. This is by archaeologist Jessica Rawson, who says this analogical approach, right, where we have very, very accurate trompe-l'oeil, kinesthetically correct objects that are only painted 2D, right? They're not the actual fabric hanging. They're not the actual wooden screen. functions in terms of analogy, and she says, quote, "In the West, we have had ways of making inanimate images powerful. The blessing and consecration of icons or statues by anointing them, or by inserting them with a tiny relic of a person, creature, or plant, were procedures that were widely adopted by medieval Christians. In these cases, a physical process involving some sort of contact with something sacred, be it consecrated oil, blood, or human bone, was deemed essential. While many other peoples have sought to give powers to their images in this way, the Chinese, right, had rather different preoccupations, in which concern with analogy played a large part. They seemed to develop a complex intellectual position that assumed that an image was convincing, that is, if it had correct features, then these features gave the image of the powers of the thing or the person depicted. It would seem as if the image or the thing or the person depicted approached so close to one another that they're in fact not distinct. Now think of the Qin Shi Huangdi, right, and the terracotta warriors, and the fantastic detail that's there. In these caves, right, so these caves become very, very Chinese. It's a very particular Chinese aesthetic where the verisimilitude, in fact, empowers the space, right, because it is so accurate. At the same time, there's something very vernacular about this, right, because those those elite families who you saw depicted as donors, these are the objects that they would be familiar with, right? These are the objects, these wall hangings, these folding screens, the seating platform. And of course, the scriptures, the contents, would be items that they would be familiar with through these large-scale lectures that they funded themselves. So my point is that these caves, what they're doing is they're replicating a lived experience exterior to the caves, the grottos themselves, but created for the donors in perpetuity to be forever in close contact with the Buddha, with Śākyamuni, and with the other deities and bodhisattvas and Buddhas in the face of a declining Dharma or disintegrating Dharma. So thank you very much. Thank you for your patience. I think for those of you who need to leave, please feel free. I think there's food also, if you'd like. Feel free to get up and get some. Do we have time for questions? Yeah. So. Yes.
Curious about the source of the text that had the cartouche language on it.
Yes. Yeah.
Was it in cash?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So
how is it tied to this particular thing?
So it's because in the cartouches on the screens themselves, it's these texts, right? So this text isn't the complete text for all the screens in Cave 61, but it is for some of them. Was that the text? You know, it comes from the same period. It has the same text. We can't be certain, but it's likely. If not, it might have been used for another situation. But yeah, so. Yes. Mm-hmm.
What are your major findings and what are the difference from the other scholars' researches and also you just your books is like about the architecture or the stories about that because as far as of course I didn't get any chance to basically speak, but I wish I could just get some information from your presentation. So actually, but still when there is my question is that the awards or literature, okay, so they have like a parallel lines, story, variations, but they also painted on the walls or the is just like the researchers just start out from the just paintings on the walls, they just purely there, just narrative writing about that.
Okay, so this question of bianwen, right? So this is transformation text, the so-called transformation text. This is meant to be a semi-vernacular genre of narrative literature. And we have a number of texts. What's interesting about these texts is that they're a transitional text from religious prosometric, prose and verse texts that we have from Buddhism into secular topics. Okay, so these are topics that have to do with history or various historical figures. There's been a lot of attention paid to these texts, and they are important, but they've overshadowed, in some ways, it's a very, very small corpus. There are very few of these texts, but they became very popular, very interesting to scholars because they were this transitional period. So we don't have illustrations of these texts on the wall, right? So there's not a one-to-one correspondence. Those are texts, right? Those are manuscript texts. They're very interesting, but they're related to these fozhuan, these Buddhist narratives that I showed you, but they're a little different. But unfortunately, it's not one-to-one correspondence. We have one illustrated manuscript that was used in performance, we know. These other texts that I mentioned, these yinyuan or yuanqi, these texts, we know that they were used in rituals because they have marks and annotations, marginalia on them, and also a ritual setting. So ritual texts that began and end them. There's a ritual format to them, so we know that those were used. But they don't. None of these texts match up in detail to the illustrations, right? So none of these popular texts. Yep.
So thanks for the great talk. I'm really intrigued by the conclusion of this idea that what we're seeing in these caves are sort of static representations of what might have been occurring outside the caves. So the murals may be standing in for printed scrolls that would be accompanying Sutra lectures and so forth. So can you say a little bit more about that? Are you so in a cave where you have multiple different tableaus around? Would that be one ritual event, or is it representing different events? Do they go together in a particular way, or are they just sort of thrown in there?
Yeah, my sense is that they're covering all angles, right? So typically, if you were having an exegetical performance, right, one of these sujang of a Tamsaka Sutra, you would hang that in the background of the monk or the cleric who was there'd be several actually, but the cleric who was performing. I don't think you would hang all of, I mean, this is, but it's very interesting. I mean, what we have, just to go back, is, there's just this very fascinating proportionality to the text. These sutra lectures were divided into two types. One had to do with sutras, the other with these narratives. This is the division we get in the caves themselves between these two registers. These are idealized settings at the same time, right? But they're filled with objects that people would have been familiar with, done in, as Chinese do so well, proportionally and aesthetically correct. But yeah, so that's a good question, because I don't think you'd see that many. It's
sort of a compilation of all the possibilities.
Yeah. Exactly. And it's very interesting because these are the exact same sutras that we have from Dunhuang, so there's a correspondence there. So yeah.
This is the centuries of the age of esoteric Buddhism, but there doesn't seem to be new inscription much of a place for it in these
right. Absolutely. No, absolutely. You're absolutely right. It's very interesting. There's very I did an article on esoteric Buddhism at Dunhuang I can refer you to, but it's fascinating because there's so little, and I think in part because these caves are very vernacular, right? Esoteric Buddhism is something that you need interpreters for, and so what you have here is that, that you have a type of Buddhism that is very much in sync with the people who are funding it, right? Whose ability to understand and interact with a Buddhism that is very basic in its goals. But there's not that much. I mean, of course, there are a few caves that are specifically esoteric. But in terms of the imagery, yeah, absolutely not. And I think because that in part highlights the vernacularity of these caves, the accessibility. So yeah.
This is just my observation. From the images that we are seeing, the artisans are very Chinese.
Yep.
Okay, it didn't seem much of Indian influence, and the Tibetan temples in Beijing, on the other hand,
Yep.
they're closer to Indian culture. And so I was thinking that means that these people have had the ancient Europe Chinese already have had a lot of Buddhism for a long time. So the pictures of the Chinese buildings and the clothes they were wearing were very Chinese.
Yep.
And there was one very ancient Buddhist temple in Shanxi, very Indian looking. So that was early.
Right.
So then later on, they become more and more Chinese. So
Absolutely.
I was thinking from this, and
Yeah.
I
Well, this
have
is
the impression that Buddhism had been in the Chinese culture for a long time by the time these artisans were doing.
Yeah. Well, it's very interesting because at Dunhuang we see this very clearly, right? We see this shift from Central Indic and Central Asian styles and influences to something that's very Chinese, that's very sinified. Yeah, but it.
You will have
Sure.
Women dancing.
Well, we do see Fei Tian and the like, but what's important here is that they're from the Tang period onward, they become very Chinese, right? Yeah. So the Tang are they're very confident, right? They're they know who they are. There's a sense of self, a sense of but also cosmopolitanism, right? Where they can be Chinese, they can allow for other influences, but it's a very confident, very Chinese, very sinified aesthetics that takes over. And so in the earlier case, you'll see the Central Asian influences very clearly, but this is so Chinese. And my point is that they're so Chinese in ways that reflect sort of aesthetic modes as well, such as this notion, this importance of analogy and verisimilitude.
No, so. This is not your topic, but does that mean that you have a very inequality of wealth in the society? So some families were so wealthy they can commission such an elaborate cave.
Absolutely, yeah. This has been an ongoing situation, but these are the elite families. Now, what's really great is that at Dunhuang, at Mogao, we also have caves that are this big, right? And they're completely correct. They're completely proportional. Nobody studied these. This is one of the things I want to do. But they're like mini doll caves. So what it meant is that, okay, as long as it's analogically correct, right, proportionally correct, if you don't have that much money, you can't do one of these, you can at least do a little mini cave, right? And they've got little benxing, little Sutra tableaus and little screens. And unfortunately, there are no figures inside, but they're great because they really bear out this idea that it's analogy and proportionality and accuracy that is what's important, right? So, yeah. Any other? Yeah.
What level of individuation do you have with the
Oh, I'm sorry, with the...
how individualized are the portraits of the thing?
Oh, that's a great question. Yeah, they're not that much. It's really what's. Yeah, exactly. That's why the cartouches are there. Also to make sure that people know. But there's with Chinese portraiture, it's only much later in the Ming and Qing certainly where you get individuated faces. Otherwise, it's a roll, right? So it's there is some indication of age. Certainly, status is indicated by size. But there's not, there are very few features. And it's interesting, one of my students once asked me, they said, well, do they change the faces as they get older, right? So do they, as the people, and I said, of course, no, because you want a moment frozen in time. You want that fixed liturgical moment with that connection, Ketchian or Jieyuan, with the deity in perpetuity. So yeah. Yes. Yeah. Well, they would use torch. Yeah. So they're far below ground, right? So Yeah, so they would use torches, but what's again, these caves are some of them are quite large. These large family caves from this period, and and you would go in with a torch. Even now they're dark, and they're typically just one chamber in, but they would have used lit torches to carve them out and to paint. I mean, it's fantastic. But of course, the ceilings are painted as well. I mean, so there's quite detailed, but they're not damaged by soot. This is what's so incredible, So, no. Right. Exactly. And it makes it very clear that these were very private sacred spaces. And once. And it really is about the donation, right? The gesture of donating, right? The gesture of donating these spaces to the Buddha, as presenting the Dharma in these scriptures that are painted to the Buddha, with you included, of course, right? So, yeah. Yeah, interesting. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So, okay. Any other questions? Okay, well, thank you so much.
Let's take